Crazy.
All right,
Right.
we'll get this started, but we'll give a little bit of grace time.
For the late Nicks.
Yeah. I do like pick your favorite natural disaster. That's a
Questions. People could actually like get on the chat and say
Yeah.
what if you had to live in a place that had a natural disaster, like every place has it, like what would be your preference?
I said hurricane.
I said hurricane because you can prep.
Or blizzard too. Like I've been in Tahoe and we've been snowed out. And as long as you're ready for it and you have chains and like food supplies
And heat
and
or
heat.
something, or
I mean that
or a way of getting warm. Yeah, for sure.
because it did take the power out, which was very rare for Tahoe. Tahoe's pretty prepped for stuff like that. I think
Yeah.
the hardest part is being in like the DC area where like we're prepped for nothing. So like anything that comes our way is like a natural disaster because
What
we're
is
not.
a natural disaster there? What is considered a natural disaster?
We did have a derecho, and I feel like I've been in a lot of natural disasters. I was in DC during the derecho. I wasn't living here, but was visiting my family, and we had a tree fall on my house. So,
That's a good one. Well, I
mhm.
was in a tornado. And
Yeah.
it actually came right across the side of my house. Sounded like I was in a war zone. And blew out all my skylights. I really didn't know it was coming. And knocked over the electricity pole, and I had like 60,000 watts of electricity in blue flame, like pouring out from it, like past my backyard. That was nuts.
But
And it was
tornadoes like that, you never know where they're going to land.
yeah,
Tricky.
never know. And the grocery store that I was at was pummeled, and I was at it 6 minutes before it actually hit. I could have been in there. Isn't that nuts? I saved my receipt.
That is crazy.
All right, give it another minute or two here, and then we'll get started.
See, now our attendees know way too much about us.
Right, I'm not going to adjust this anymore. It is what it is.
Josh, you never answered your preferred natural disaster.
And I think maybe volcano, you know where it's coming from?
And you're going away?
Like,
Just as long as you don't live in the zone of the volcano.
yeah.
I guess that's part two, right?
Yeah. Lava, lava. Did you guys ever play lava when you were kids?
Of course.
No. Did
You
not.
Floor. You're talking about the floor is lava, right?
Yeah, the floor is lava. You know, different parts of the floor is lava, so you'd hop around it like
No.
hot lava.
All right. Well, I think at this point, let's get started. So today we've got the webinar, which is Building Buzz, Realistic PR Expectations for Early Startups. So just to preface that, you know, when you're working in a startup or you're a founder, just working there, in that very beginning, you know, it can really feel like you've got something that's awesome and you want everybody to know about it. You don't understand why people aren't really jazzed about what you're building. And it can really feel like a disconnect, right? And you look up and you think you should have that next big story. And so what we're talking about today is really how to communicate effectively, tell your story, and get that attention that you want.
Yeah.
So, sponsoring today is Logic Boost. We say we back founders. Basically, if you're an early stage B2B SaaS startup, you've got that MVP, you've got a customer or two, and everything else is question marks, right? What do you do next? How do you ramp up? How do you get to that next phase? So if that sounds like let's talk and see how we can take the next step together. All right. So I'd like to take a second to introduce our presenters today. On the left, we've got Carla Helms. So she's the Chief Evangelist and Anti-PR Strategist for Jodo PR Disruptors. KJ, if you want to say a few words about your experience and your background, go for it.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Josh. Good to be with you again, Melissa. I want to welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. I go by KJ, as you could hear Josh say. My background is in crisis management. So first half of my career, I worked on bailing companies out of trouble in the court of public opinion. About halfway through, I was challenged by some serial entrepreneurs that had startups that wanted to get put on the map. And I took that challenge and applied my crisis management techniques to the media's algorithm with a little bit of psychology, and was able to successfully put those startups on the map. And we were able to track metrics, as we went along, overall business, increasing, marketing ROI increasing, customer acquisition cost lowering. And that became a trademarked process that we use today called anti-PR. So for the, half of my career, crisis management, the other half, using those techniques to put new startups on the map. And we've done that for many, many companies and campaigns, startups, taking them all the way to IPOs or large valuations or acquisitions or mergers. That's me.
Awesome. Thanks for that, KJ. On our right, we've got Melissa Klein. She's the CEO of Melissa Klein PR. Melissa, take it away.
Thanks again for having me, Josh. Great to be with you again, KJ. I started my career actually as a lobbyist in DC, and then moved out to the Bay Area, where I started working for a boutique PR firm called Launch Squad. And this was at the very beginning of Web 2.0. So back in 2005, when consumer tech was really starting to rise, and I worked with early stage companies, helping them put themselves on the map as well. Companies like Tumblr, Evernote, Diapers.com, all of which were companies that we worked and helped to tell their story, and now are well-known brand names. So I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit more about, what PR is and how early stage companies can utilize it and make their names brand. So.
All right. Well, thanks again to both of you for helping us today. Just some quick housekeeping. So if you do have questions, there is a QA tab. You'll see that up on the menu. And we'll either try to cover those during the conversation, or make sure that they're taken care of at the end. And then at the very end of the presentation, we'll also have some helpful links, some resources, and then how to contact our two presenters. All right. So I guess let's jump in kind of at the most basic thing that we can. And this question to both of you, what do you, at a high level, what do you think, what is PR? And how does an early stage company think about it? How should they really start to look at it so that they can use it effectively?
Great question. KJ,
Yeah.
you want to start?
I knew you were going to ask me that. We're always so nice to each other. You go. No, you go. Sure. Public relations is really easy to understand when you're in a crisis. People understand that when they can't hire, they can't compete, they can't sell. But the real purpose of PR is to change minds, get people to think differently about something, get them to think newly about something, right? Lots of new technology today, disrupting the status quo. People have never thought about it before. And then once you're able to successfully do that, you keep them thinking the same way, right? This is why public companies are fanatical about their PR and their goodwill. So it's used today as part of top of funnel, like engagement that gets people more interested and more comfortable in doing business with you. That way your marketing and sales can really reap those rewards without having to spend all their time educating, right? So if you need to really educate the markets, if you need to appear more credible, if you need to appear bigger than what you are, which is more credibility, in order to compete with the bigger behemoths or your bigger competitors, those are typically the reasons early stage companies use it and use it effectively.
Exactly. I just add a little, like, from my perspective, when people ask me, like, what is PR? What do you do? PR has like such a dirty like connotation to it, which it always makes me laugh. Like, we're not terrible people. We actually are very nice. But I like to think about it in terms of like storytelling. So looking at, what's everyone has something that every business has something that they're trying to sell. And you may think that your product is the most amazing, unique thing, but differentiating it amongst a sea of others can be difficult. And so if you think about it in terms of story, that I think is the best type of PR. And I think early stage companies in particular, they're coming out and trying to make a market for themselves. And they're trying to literally break in where there might be a larger behemoth. And if they look at it from the perspective of like, okay, what are we trying to accomplish? And then how do we tell a story? I mean, look at Apple. Apple is like the prime example of this. Like, Steve Jobs was masterful at making every product launch not just a product launch, but like part of the larger story that he was trying to tell about changing like the way that individuals use technology. I'm old enough to remember that, computers were not something that every person had in their home. In fact, it was thought of as something that, it was very techy. That was like high tech. And he was able to make computers accessible to people, like make it something that they wanted to bring into their home in the same way that they wanted a television set, in the same way that they wanted a telephone. And so that's what, like, when I'm looking at a company and helping them, advise them in the early stages, I really sit down with founders and say, what story are you trying to tell? Tell me a little bit about what you do. And like, let's think about it in terms of story. That way we have like an arc that we can continue to move forward, as opposed to just saying, here's who we are and here's my product and like get me in the New York Times.
Oh my God, I totally agree with you on that. And Melissa, do you feel like, that story, I've always found that it resonates around the why. Like, people really buy into the why of why a company is doing business. It's like people buy into that before they buy into the what.
Absolutely. 100%. 100%. And it is like, if you just think about it as a reader, like what we're ultimately trying to do in many cases is place a story about a company or a product, and think about the stories that you like to read. When I'm picking up the Times or the Journal or the Washington Post, like I'm looking for something that's going to keep my attention and that is talking about something meaningful. So like, why did you build this product? Like, what was and any good story has a little bit of struggle in it. What's the tension, So when, instead of just thinking about like, obviously there are news announcements and things to be said, but really thinking about like the background and the why. I mean, that's what gets me excited about doing this job.
I agree with you. And the background's really important. Like, I love how you give examples. I'll give our attendees today an example, like KnowBe4, very well-known cyber company, right? Went from startup, IPO, $1 billion valuation, now they're a private company. In the beginning, when they needed to make a case for their training services, they You know, the PR campaign was all about telling the struggle that businesses had with being cyber breached, cyber crimes that weren't going reported. And they were really creative, finding those that actually did report it, then extending those statistics out of the number that wasn't, how much money was being lost. And they just exploited that controversy over and over to show why cybersecurity for employees training was needed, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you mentioned, a struggle, right? They just kept putting out that struggle.
Yeah. I can think of that as well when, if you look at companies like any sort of enterprise company. I worked with a company way back when. This is going to sound, again, I'm dating myself terribly, but but it was before the iPhone even existed, and the company was called Clairmail, and it allowed you to do banking from your phone, which at the time was like, oh my God. Number one, there's so many reasons why like consumers were like, we'll never trust it over text. Like, and you did have to text because you didn't have like apps or any of that stuff. But the struggle being like, the struggle part of it was getting over like consumers' fear of, that like security of banking, like in a new way. And so really talking about like, think about all the ease with which you're able to do things if you're just able to bank by your phone. And again, we did a great job. Like it's moved forward because now it's like second nature. Someone's like banking on your phone, obviously, but back in 2004, no one was doing that.
Yeah. Huge education curve, right? Wow. That's a good one.
So I think
Go back and forth all day.
Yeah.
You both brought up a good point, which is, building your why and explaining that, really trying to focus in on what your message is. I think coming back to that, and here's my why. Let's say you've got a cool product, you've got a cool why, the why is great. You've got that underdog story. How do you actually get attention? If you can get that grounding, how do you take that, get the not only attention, but the right attention, and be realistic about what to expect?
Great question.
You get to go with that.
Okay, thank you. I think, not to get too in the weeds, and I don't want to assume knowledge, but the way that the media works, just to take a step back, is that media have things called beats. And so there's people who write about specific topics, and that is their beat. So one of the ways where like a very early stage company might be able to get that story out is working with a consultant or a firm and identifying the writers on the beat that they are trying to. So if it's like enterprise technology, if it's consumer technology, if it's mobile, if it's AI, all of these various publications today have writers that cover those areas. And they're actually very small publications, but very niche, that have the right audience that also cover that. So just number one is identifying who you want to write the story. The right person writing the right story makes all the difference in the world. I think that's one of the things that people don't give enough weight to, is that sometimes you're so hungry for any coverage that you'll go with any coverage. And that's not actually your best move. You really want to look at who writes about this, who's going to get this. And maybe they won't write it today. Maybe maybe they're too busy, or it's not the right time yet. But them writing it in 3 months from now is a better move than just going to someone who doesn't really understand the beat, the technology, and will not tell that full story. I mean, the number of times where I do a lot of funding announcements for companies, and they want to announce their funding, and I always advise them, like, that's a great news piece, but like, let's think about like the larger story that you want to tell, and use that as a moment in time to tell that larger story. There are plenty of writers who will write X company received X amount from X VC firm and then put it out there. What you really want to do is use it, find a writer who will dig into the story behind it. And then the funding is just the why now. Like, why do I need to write about this now? Is the news piece, but the story in and of itself is why is what you really want to get out there. So my long-winded way of answering your question, Josh, is how do you get it out there? One is like straight up old school media relations, finding the right reporters who will write your story. And even if it takes a little bit of time, finding the right reporter and the right publication is really, really crucial.
Agreed. Ditto, 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 ditto. I will add to that, just to reinforce what Melissa says, is that finding the right reporter, the right beat, she's in essence saying, know who your target audience is. And those writers and reporters are writing and, they are communicating to them. So the reporters are your gatekeepers, right? And knowing your target audience helps you figure out who the writers and the beats are. That's like the number one mistake that gets made, because people, like she said, they think it's anybody, but you're not going to sell to anybody. So why would you put your message out to anybody in the media? And the other thing is that bigger story that she was talking about. It's like, never be married to your solution. Like, never. Like, number one rule in branding, be married to the problems that your audiences are trying to solve. In PR, we like to exploit the controversy. What's the harm? What's the problem? What's the economic pain point? What are the issues that your buyers, your customers, your prospective clients are trying to solve? Exploit the hell out of that. Pardon my French. And then those writers will automatically want to know what the solution is. They'll want to insert that in, right? So there's your crafting a compelling story. And then of course they want to know why you're doing this. Well, that goes back to your why. You really want to like level the economic playing field. You really want to make things more transparent or democratize tech for people. That's where you become the good guy. But do exactly what Melissa said. I'm just reinforcing her.
And I'll also say, thank you for reinforcing. I'll also say that thinking, I think a common mistake is, I think I mentioned this, but I'll reinforce it, is that you're going to get coverage right away, and you need to get coverage right away. But as KJ pointed out, you want to look and think who is your audience? What do you really want to accomplish with this? And look at it in terms of steps. So step one may just be having a meeting with a reporter. And like, it might feel like this is frustrating, I'm not getting anything out of it. But if you meet with that reporter and with no other agenda other than, I just want to give you here are some of my thoughts about the industry. I know you cover this, it's AI, and then they have your information when maybe a story comes up and it's not directly about your product, but it's about the space, and they had such a great conversation with you that they'll come back to you as a resource. So just the story is important, but also like the little steps in getting that story also serve a purpose. And so when you're looking at like your objectives, and we'll get to this later, but like how to quantify like what's a win in PR, these little steps are actually wins and important, because I can also say today, the number of companies that are out there being funded is exponentially bigger than the number of reporters and outlets out there. So we are in there's a big disadvantage. There's a lot of noise and a little bit of people writing about, trying to weed through that noise. So you really have to be patient and understand that dynamic, because it will only serve you to be patient and really understand who you want to talk to and when.
Yeah, patience really is a virtue in this. And another way to back up what Melissa says, just think of it like marketing and selling to the media, right? I mean, when you're marketing, you have subproducts, right? You have leading indicators, you have lagging indicators, right? You want to get to the close, you want to get to the gross income, the revenues, but there are steps involved to do that. You have so many conversations, you have an MQL, you have an SQL, it's the same way with the media. And if you have a process like she's talking about, and you know what that is, you're not really patient, you're just following it. You know exactly what's next.
Great point.
Can I say something on being realistic? You mentioned,
Yeah,
did you mention realistic? Like, what's realistic? Melissa talked about that, being realistic as far as your expectations. There is a process, just like marketing and sales has a process. And listen, you need to know how big your market is. right? That's almost like your influencer vulnerability score. I mean, if your market is really big, then you need to figure out how to communicate directly to those beats that are going to communicate to as many of your target audience as possible. And it's not a one-hit wonder. Do it again with several, right? So that you can start to penetrate with your message that particular audience. So you have to really look at it from a mathematical point of view.
I love that. I also love that you were talking about like there's more like there are lots of different ways to accomplish what you need to accomplish. Like I can think of a company that I worked with a few years ago. The company's called Makuna, and they made a protein powder, which out of like you would think, which is not usually a typical client. I'm in tech, but they were innovating in this area, so that I took them on for that very reason. And obviously, a protein powder they're trying to sell to consumers, so it's like a straight up consumer push. But like that market is so saturated. So like, how do you break through? And instead of just trying to push like try to get influencers, all of which are great things. But this company is so small, like they can't go out and pay for some really expensive influencer. So we went the opposite route and was like, what if we could get them in like Air One, a small specialty grocery store. And then from there, then people discover them. Like the discovery is through the store. So the media push was via the buyers at that. Instead of the consumers who were buying protein powder, it was buyers at grocery stores. Like what are they reading and how do we get to them? And we found a really small niche, but great, very well read publication called Food Dive. And we pitched them on the story. And then that led to, they're now in Whole Foods. So like, this is like, and now consumers are discovering them in Whole Foods. Instead of us spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to get like Kylie Jenner to like put some Makuna into her, drink, we went a different route. And what many wouldn't be like, oh, it's just this online publication. The Dive publications are fantastic. They're well read by the people, like very smart people with buying power. So
Decision
like
makers.
Decision makers,
They
exactly.
actually have more power and return on investment than a lot of your major mainstream media, because mainstream media has got to communicate a story that communicates to the masses. And I get it. It's an ego thing and you can do that. But what Melissa's talking about is return on investment. Then they got into Whole Foods. Was that it?
Yep.
Amazing. I cut you off. Sorry. I got excited.
No, I think that was it. I was just we were going back and forth, reinforcing each other.
It's a love fest today.
So you both brought up some interesting points here, a lot around understanding your audience. And I think, Melissa, what you said about too many stories chasing too few reporters, that certainly feels true from anybody that's tried to, get out there. I guess one of the questions that we've kind of been circling is kind of the double-edged sword of chasing trends, right? If you're a company and you want that story right now, you just slap AI on it, right? And I feel like you guys could probably expand on how to leverage what people are talking about more effectively.
Yeah. You want me to go?
Yeah, you go.
I think it goes back to, you don't want to be the next big thing or the next big fad always. Your why should be tied to a strategy of a messaging, and your messaging really is to educate your target audiences so they know why they need to use you. They need to trust you. They need to have your subject matter expertise. They know that you're going to be able to handle them. They know you're going to be able to help them. And listen, the best way to do it is to really exploit the problems that you solve. That's extremely trendy because if those problems aren't being solved, guess what? They're in the news, right? Long-term disagreements, of how things should be, haven't been. New technology that solves a pent-up demand. Why has this been a pent-up demand? What's been the problems with that? The money lost, right? The economic impact. The diversity, how it opens up the door for, letting SMBs actually compete. I mean, there are real problems that your technology solves. And if you just pay attention to that, and then use your subject matter expertise of what that's new news, right? That you can actually make it more interesting, more timely because of your experience in the market, the data that you have from the clients. You don't have to go chasing the next big fad. You can actually be the trend. That's what I think.
I think that's absolutely right. I do think there are moments, we used to call it news, and we still do, like newsjacking. So like if you are in the e-commerce space and then something happens, or it's like, Cyber Monday, like trying to figure out how to newsjack along, or breaking news. But the thing that I always remind my clients is like, you have to have an interesting take. Like if your take is the same as every other person, there's you're not saying anything. So why would they take your quote over, the Bezos at Amazon? Like this e-commerce company is not going to get into it versus someone bigger unless you have something to say. And I'm not saying be controversial for the sake of being controversial, but I am saying be creative and think creatively about what you want to say, because it's going to be you're going to be paying a PR firm or a consultant. Essentially, it's a waste of their time for them to be pitching something that isn't interesting. Like it goes back to storytelling. Like what do you like to read? Like I'm so grateful for when I started off. I worked for a small boutique PR firm. I had the greatest guys. I didn't know anything about PR. I had to Google it. I remember Googling like how to write a press release, like for the job interview. But I was like, oh, I do government relations. Public relations is the same thing. But like when I first got there, they were just like, here are a bunch of magazines, read. And that was my first week. It was just reading articles and like getting a sense of what people write about and like what's a good quote. And another thing that like I learned from that in newsjacking or giving quotes is that if you proactively offer an image along with your quote, and you have a long story that's in, there's a trend story in the Times, and you're fortunate enough to be included in that, but it's like one line, but you have a unique, interesting piece of art to go with it. That's gonna like you could newsjack a story that you just newsjack by just providing an interesting image, and people will read it, and they always go to the image, and then your quote may overtake the other 3 quotes that are in that story. So I guess my takeaways would be like, think about what you want to say. Don't get frustrated if you're not, or if you're not getting traction and you're trying to newsjack, really look at what you're saying, because if it's not anything different than anyone else is saying, then you're not going to get on CNBC or Bloomberg, And if you are fortunate enough to get an inbound or know that you're included in a story, don't wait for the reporter to ask you for some images. Just proactively send them and think creatively on them, because just like I said, the quote has to be interesting. The images have to be interesting too. Images are so important to stories. And I feel like people sort of kind of throw like a boring screenshot of think about the image. It's really, really important. And it can be the difference between getting a print story and an online story.
That is so true. People don't think about images enough. I remember one time I just overloaded a journalist with images on ink. They got a 13-page spread because no one else did this. Yeah. And it was like, oh my gosh, just be a little more proactive, just a little more creative, do the job for the journalist. Oh my God, they're busy. And like Melissa said, the media love opposing views. They love opposing forces. If it really does fit with your brand and something's not right or a different perspective, like offer it up. They will love to publish that.
Absolutely.
I think there's an interesting parallel with a effective social media strategy too. Usually the guiding principle there is don't just chime in on something that's topical. You actually want to advance the conversation, right?
Yes.
So if you're not going to add and move the conversation forward, you're just raising your hand and saying, me too. No one cares. And I think, what you're talking about with these stories and newsjacking, is like that magnified times 100.
But it also is the reason why you like take that baby step with that reporter, you know, like just going to coffee, or I don't even know if like now it's pretty much just phone calls and Zooms thanks to COVID, but it's still that first step is so important. And I feel like, you know, we'll get to like what you can expect, but people just get so frustrated because like I've been working with this firm for 3 months and they've done nothing except I've met with like 6 reporters, and it's like that's how this happens. Like if they've done nothing, then you have a right to be upset. But if you're taking meetings and actually getting to know members of the media that matter to you, but they're not writing, just be patient.
Patient and consistent.
Yes.
I, just want to be wary of time. We've got probably 10 more minutes to go through a little bit of the more meat of this, which I think for a lot of people is trying to figure out when they're ready for PR. And the second part is like, how, as an early stage company, money's tight, how do you think about this in terms of your budget?
Great questions. I'll tackle the when are you ready for PR. I always think I talk to a lot of early stage companies, and I sit down with them and we go through what I call their assets. What are your assets? Like, do you have a piece of news to announce? Do you have anything that's interesting or new that's happening? And then if you're especially on the enterprise side, you have to have customers, and customers that are willing to talk. And maybe they can talk off the record or without, with attribution, but it's really, really difficult to get stories in enterprise technology if you don't have a customer who was willing to talk or a customer using it. If you've just started something and just maybe the investors are super unique. Like I've had companies come to me and it's been like a hodgepodge of like tech cool kids who invested, and you're like, why did like this person invest in this? I'll take them on as a client because I know that I can get a story for them. But if it's like a very small company, no customers, or they have customers, but none of them will even go like refuse to talk because they don't want to mess up a like competitive advantage, I'll be like, think through what your assets are and come back to me when you have one of those various things.
Yeah, not everybody's a fit for PR right away.
Yeah.
Good. Should I answer the one about the budget?
Yeah.
Like it's the big question, right?
It is.
How should it fit into your PR? How should PR fit into your marketing budget? Or, what is the budget for PR?
All of
yeah. Listen, the media actually works on an algorithm and a cadence, just like everything else. You don't have to have something all the time. You could actually put out quarterly stories, once, like half a year. I wouldn't go less than that. And, have a process to be able to do that. You could do a short-term blitz campaign and then use that collateral, those publicity pieces, in your social media, your email, your digital ads, your blogging, to get way more amplification on that. And so, I don't know how aggressive some startups are on their marketing budgets. I know the fast growth companies that we work with, their marketing budgets can be pretty aggressive and scale as they go. But, you want to think of PR as like 30, sometimes even 50% of your marketing budget at first, if you're really trying to establish thought leadership. And if that is too small because your marketing budget is small, then you should look for firms that have a track record and have a rev share program. That would be my suggestion. And that you put a skin in some game, they put skin in the game too. But really, honestly, you don't have to go at it like a public company, always putting news out every week, every month. You can be really strategic every quarter, and you can fit it into your marketing budget.
Yeah, I love that. I love using, stories as, marketing collateral. Like that's, and we talk about this a lot, where stories, using certain stories to help you get other stories. Cause like, I'm a big believer that media begets media. So if you have a really interesting, business story, you might be able to take that story to a non-competitive outlet and get your CEO, on a podcast or something else by just using the validation of that story. But yeah, I'd also offer that I love the idea of working with firms that will take stock or a rev share or something along those lines if you don't have the budget for it. And there are a bunch of consultants out there. So I'm a consultant. I work with smaller companies, and I typically work with the companies before they get a PR firm because they don't have $30,000, $40,000 a month to spend. And so I'll work with them until, they're ready, or and sometimes they'll put it on pause because, they'll have other priorities that they need to work through.
Yeah, but consultants are really good because they can help you as you're growing establish a cadence with the media. If you're going to be a do-it-yourself, or you're going to have someone in the marketing department learn a little bit about this with a consultant and help them, the consultants can help that. As companies scale, then they can go into hiring PR firms. And really, honestly, you want to work with someone that can actually grow with you. That's what I think.
I agree.
Well, we're running a little low on time. I do want to mention that there are some practical tips on what to look for in consultants and PR firms on our blog. Also a list of questions that people can run through, and kind of a more practical take on what to look for and how to feel out the person that's right for you or the firm that's right for you. I guess just kind of at the end here, one question that is going to be central to any founder or entrepreneur, how does PR fit into a fundraising strategy? Because we've been talking about money, right? That revenue is key. How do I use PR to get people to give me more money?
It's a great question. I do this a lot. Like as I mentioned, I work with a lot of companies who've already raised money or are thinking through. I think that's where, going back to what we talked about earlier, really thinking through who the audience is for news. And so, I worked, after I was at a PR firm, I was in-house at a company called fab.com, and we were in the process of raising funds. And we were thinking through ways that we might get our story out, and then where we wanted to get that story out to. And, I said, what's our goal here? And the goal was, we want to raise more money. So then we started looking at more financially focused publications like the Wall Street Journal, knowing that, like, the Wall Street Journal versus the New York Times, what's the difference? One of the bigger differences is that the Journal is very numbers oriented. So if you're looking to, you have a fundraising strategy, you want to do that. Number one, you want to ask yourself, like, what numbers am I willing to put out there into the world? And again, I'm not saying that you should put them out there, but, like, let's think, what's the risk reward? So should I put my revenues out there? Well, if it means getting a story in the Wall Street Journal, is that, thinking through that type of stuff. And then also looking at, creative ways to take your product and make it a little bit bigger. So with Fab, we were an e-commerce company. At the time, we were competing with Groupon and One Kings Lane. Like, these are all old companies. But what we noticed early on was that we were selling kind of quirky, interesting things, and people shared it on Facebook a lot. And we kind of were like bouncing ideas back and forth. And we were like, when I buy something on Amazon, it's not like I post on Facebook, like, I just bought some toilet paper on Amazon. But we saw it with Fab, like, they were using that button and sharing it. And so we kind of sat around, we're like, well, I guess we're navigating something. It's like social commerce. And so we created this whole narrative, and we put out data around it, around social commerce. And then we pitched it to the Wall Street Journal because we wanted to raise funds. If we wanted to, we could have pitched it to the New York Times and did a little bit of tweaking if we wanted to get consumers on board, but our goal was to raise funds. So we looked at a financially focused publication, figured out a story that made us seem different, oh, well, we're competing with these other companies, but they don't have social commerce down like we have social commerce down, and then all of a sudden we have Andreessen interested in investing in the company. So I would suggest thinking about who your audience is and then thinking about a way to differentiate your company so you can get an interesting story. And it doesn't have to be the journal. It can be, like I said, one of those smaller publications like Marketing Dive if you're a marketing technology company, or looking at, if you're an ad technology, going to Digiday. There are a bunch of publications.
Those are great stories. I will add on to that. Like in our particular realm, B2B and tech and so forth, when companies want to raise money, the PR efforts are really around brand visibility and credibility, right? And to make investors very interested, like Melissa was saying, it's like, how big is the market, right? What's the economic impact of that market as it expands? Like, what are the biggest problems? How does your solution fit in? How is that going to make an impact, right? And you could do a blitz and have a few stories in not only financial publications like Melissa was talking about, but other beats that show that story just in different angles, and then put together a media kit so that you can show that in your investor deck. For instance, a med tech company will take like Infobionic, right? Remote cardiac monitoring for patients in real time. It actually cuts out the middleman, so cardiologists can monitor their patients and then send them directly to the hospital if needed. Huge economic impact, changes a whole economic value network. So not only putting that data in financial publications, right, but also in hospital publications, health system publications, these smaller ones, right? Even cardiologists, and even a few stories about consumers using this and having saved their lives. You have a package right there. That's called a blitz. It doesn't have to be a humongous expense, but then that deck is made into a media kit, and that can be used for investors. Not only do they see that, but it creates more awareness in the market. And for instance, Infobionic was able to raise several rounds doing that over and over again. And then Mayo Clinic, and brought them into the fold based on that. So you can do that sort of strategy over and over. Start small, build it a little bigger the next time, bigger the next time, and do your rounds that way.
Absolutely. That's spot on.
I think those are some great points. And from an investor perspective, what people are looking for is when they bet on a company, how big could it possibly get? And I think a lot of times that comes down to a discussion of revenue and where the revenue trajectory is going. The other way is that you look at how compelling the problem and the why is. We talked about that. And then also just enthusiasm, like how much buzz is around this. So when you have stories that are out there and you have visibility, you look like a better bet. So I think that's really something that's central to what you're talking about. I do want to be real wary of the end of time here. So I think as we wrap up, if we could maybe have kind of your key takeaways, your big advice. You've got, one thing to impart on people. What would it be?
From my perspective, I would say if I were to give one piece of advice is to really think about story. Think about story, which also means think about audience. So I guess that's two things, but think about story and audience when you're thinking about your product or company, and try to tell a story. The best PR, in my opinion, are companies that tell stories. That's why I used Apple. I think they've done it brilliantly.
I agree. The story is the number one thing. And, as far as the why behind that, I will say, remember this always, that the reason why public companies are fanatical about their PR, right? They control it, press releases, stories, their whole comms department, is because today, 33% of the entire market cap of all public companies is based on goodwill, right? So they know that guiding and controlling public opinion controls the markets. It helps them expand. You can do that too. You can do that on a smaller scale. You don't have to do it on the scale of a public company, but you can do it on a consistent, smaller, growing algorithm and expand your company easier by doing that. And that's why you want to tell the stories.
All right. Thank you both. I think if anyone has any extra questions at this point, you can cover those. Otherwise.
Any questions?
So I will share this for follow-up. This is KJ's contact info as well as Melissa's. And then for further reading, we do have a blog post about this, which was content that was largely influenced by both of these PR experts. So if you want to deep dive, definitely take a look at that. Or contact Melissa or KJ. Oh, we got a question here. Let's do that.
Yeah, I'm very active on LinkedIn, guys, so you can message me. I will answer your questions.
Ditto.
So we do have a question from Ben as we're closing out here. Any tips on specific metrics to track for PR beyond UVPMs and SOV?
Yes.
This is your question.
You know what, Ben? You can contact me on LinkedIn and I can give you a whole guide on those particular metrics. But, again, know how big your audience is. And the leading metrics that you want to start tracking, right, is, impressions from press releases. Those make a difference. This guide that I have will tell you why, right? UVPM, yes, that's important. Circulation of the publications. If you know how big your audience is, and then you're communicating to the right beats, and say there's, say you have 1 million people in your target audience. I mean, that's not big enough, but say you have that, right? And you're talking to channels that communicate directly to your decision makers, and those have a readership of 35,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 or so forth. When you start getting those publicity pieces, that is the potential of your readership. 2.5%, it's industry standard, will have been exposed to your brand. That's just the 80-20 rule compounded. But those are metrics that you want to keep track of. And as you do that and you start seeing that you're communicating to many people through these opinion leader channels, and you start matching that number up with how big your audience is and how many times you have to have touch points to them, there's a whole formula for that. Then you can really start calculating your leading indicators. Lagging indicators, more hits to your website, more people coming to you, more people interested and comfortable in doing business with you. That equates to overall new business. You can start tracking, then you can start tracking marketing ROI, customer acquisition cost, but there's a whole hierarchy of that. But really remember, keep it simple. It's a mathematical game today. You want to add to that, Melissa?
I think you said it perfectly. I'm right there with you. I think the only other thing I would say is the non-tangibles, the non-number side of it would be again, meetings with reporters, that there's consistent momentum happening. And those things don't feel like they have any number attached to them, because that meeting doesn't really generate anything, but it will in the future. So just understanding that there's going to be some things that you can track very clearly, and then items that should be part of the process that you should be monitoring, but may not seem like they add any value at the current moment, but are important.
I love that. It's a sales job to the media, guys. You have to have a lot of sales guys. Not all of calls, not a lot of them are fruitful, right? Or conversations. But then you start tracking what your formula is, right? How many conversations do you have to get this? Same thing with media.
All right. Well, thank you both again for doing this. I think there's a lot of great tips here, and this will be available on demand for everybody going forward.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having us. Contact me on LinkedIn or Melissa on LinkedIn. We'll answer questions. And yeah, happy to help you guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.